Everybody. I wanted to actually add do a little bit of a supplement for the example where you created the bash shell and node. One of the things I wanted to do is also do some testing, which I think when I ended up going through the solution made things a little bit easier. And if you end up redoing the solution, I think some of this stuff might end up helping out here. So again, if you recall, we're going to be basically creating our own bash shell here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file. I'm just going to call it numbers.txt. Let's call it numbersa.txt. And so if we go in here, I'm going to create the numbers 1 to 20. Sure, there's a better way to do this. Okay, so if I was to go in this directory and I was to say cat numbers.txt, right, I would get these 20 lines. And you know, the one thing that there's all I'm going to do a very sort of limited solution to this. Again, my main thing is to sort of get you thinking a little bit more about test-driven development and also how you might end up breaking the solution up. So the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to, you know, we have the ability to sort of pipe things in here. And so if I went over here, I could pipe this and I could say word count, let's say. And again, let's sort of simplify it where, you know, here we're just going to count the number of lines, okay? So in order to go about doing that solution, or before we really do anything, the way that I sort of think about it is that there's really two parts that are going on here. There's one part of this where I'm basically parsing commands, right? I've got two different commands that I'm executing here. I've got this, you know, cat command that ends up reading a file, and I'm piping the results into this word count command. And, you know, we could pipe them really as much as we want. There's all types of things that we can end up, you know, doing here. Things could, you know, if we decided to say, you know, echo foo bar Baz, and we ended up doing a grep of oh, right, we'd get this. We're not going to go through all these. I'm just going to basically deal with the cat and the word count. But there's two different parts. There's the actual parsing, which gives you your commands that you're going to run. And there's the pipeline that actually runs the commands. And, you know, some of this stuff can be synchronous. Like, for instance, when we end up doing, you know, echo foo bar and bash, there's no files that are being opened when we end up writing our bash shell. So theoretically, you know, we don't have to, this could actually be synchronous. But of course, when we write this and we're reading files, we've got to make sure that, you know, we deal with the fact that we know when we're done when the files are read. And so, you know, if we ended up doing something like numbers a.txt and I concatenated it again, numbers a.txt, and I did word count, right, this is going to end up giving me 40. So at least these couple of examples I want to get in. And in order to do it, what I would like to do is to do a little bit of testing. So in order to set that up, let me actually open up I'm actually here ready. So let me clear this out. And so I'm going to do an npm init. And I'm going to end up using Mocha, and I'm going to use chai. And one of the reasons I like it is I think Mocha is a little bit easier to basically separate out your tests, and I think it's better at allowing you to run tests individually, although Jasmine might have some of these features as well. So I'm going to do an npm install. And I'm going to install Mocha, and I'm going to end up installing chai. And I'm going to save this as a development dependency. And I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to write some tests. So I'm going to create a folder and put all my tests in the test folder. And I'm going to add a test, and this is going to be pipeline spec.js. So what is that going to end up looking like here? Well, as starters, you might want to go in here and say pipeline and I might want to go over here and say it exists. And so if I were to go over here and say expect pipeline to be okay. Now, there's a number of issues that I'm going to run into here. And first of all, how do I end up getting my Mocha to run? Well, I'll show you how to do that. What I can do here is I could actually go to my node modules. And I could go over here and I could say Mocha, bin, Mocha. You don't have to do start, but you just have to specify where your files are located. So my files are going to be in tests, **star.js. And if I go and run that, okay, this will automatically end up failing. And the reason why it's failing is that unlike when you end up using Karma, here you actually have to bring in chai. Well, how do you bring in chai? Well, where's chai anyway? Chai we could see got installed when we did npm install. And so one of the things you can do is that if you have modules that you ended up installing, we can say chai equals require chai. And we're going to use chai's expectation. So in fact, one of the things that chai exposes is this expect function. So now we have an expect function. But notice every time that I go to make this change, I've got to rerun my test. And now I get a different error message. So that's going to be a little bit annoying. What I would like to do is actually continually run this. So the way that I'm going to do that, I'm going to actually install something called nodemon, which is going to look for changes in files. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this. Again, this is a development dependency. And this will end up running. And what I'm going to do, instead of just running my test, I'm going to say nodemon, and I'm going to specify, hey, nodemon, I want you to run under node modules, Mocha, bin, Mocha, tests, **star.js. And now it'll run the test, but it'll actually wait. And if I make a change, so if I was to go up here, say pipeline equals some object, my test would end up passing. Notice it also actually gives you a little bit of a better reporter here off the bat. So what I really want to do here is I want to get my pipeline from a require, which doesn't exist yet. And now if I did this, I would get an error that it can't end up finding this module, and I'll go back here and I'll create it. Now when I do this, and I go in here, it'll end up starting, says it still cannot find pipeline, and that actually makes sense, right? Because there's only 2 files I'm going to work with at a time here, because I actually have to go 1 level up, right? It's not in this directory. Now if I go back here, that ends up passing. So let's give some thought. Let's actually write some tests and see, how this should end up working. And so the way that I'm sort of thinking about it is that what I want to be able to do is to have this pipeline. And this pipeline is going to be composed of commands. Now, again, eventually, I'm going to basically get my commands from, parsing a string that the user ends up entering from the keyboard. But I really can separate these things out and basically, define a pipeline as something that's going to perform a number of different steps, and is going to pass, one step into the next step and think about, how that ends up looking. So I'm going to copy and paste a little bit here. So I'm going to go here and get some stuff in here for my tests. So I know that my file has the numbers 1 to 20 in it. All right, so I'm going to, let's call this number data. Let's see what we're going to want to test out here. So the way that I sort of envision this pipeline is that if I was to go and write a test, let's just, as we do this, we could just see whether or not here we see food data doesn't exist, right? I'm calling it number data. I'm going to use this a little bit later on, okay? So what I want to do here is I'm going to put a describe block. And I'm going to describe using the cat command. And I'll describe using the cat command, and let's actually reading numbers a.txt. What do we expect? Well, first of all, let's assume that we do have some method that can be used in our pipeline that's capable of reading a file. So the way that I expect this to work, and again, this is not going to happen right off the bat, is that I expect to be able to do something like this. This is what I expect how I expect my test to work. And I'll explain a little bit more about what's happening here, and we'll see if we could get started with this. And then we'll worry about maybe doing some word counts or something like that. So let's take a look and see what's happening here. So first of all, one of the things that I did here is I put in a before each block, and I'm going to comment this out just so I don't necessarily muddy the waters too much. And what I want to make sure is that this returns the contents of a file, but before I end up doing that, I'm just going to show you how this before each works. The before each would allow me to do something like this. I could say expect result to equal 42. Okay? Now, notice I've got this before each, and I've got it done here. I'm going to take that done out, and I'm going to go in here. And notice I defined outside of this my result, and I'll go in here. So before each will run before each of your tests, before each of your it functions. So I'm going to go in here and I'll put in 33. I'll get this to fail. And I'll go back here and it says, well, you expected I expected 33 to be equal to 42, which it's not. And let's change this so it passes. So what does that done do that I had before? Well, if I put a done in here, the way that this works is that not all your tests are going to be synchronous. You might have tests that open up files. You might have tests that end up connecting to a database. So the done allows you to say, hey, look, there's something that's happening here, but don't run my tests until I call done. And so now if I go back here, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to wait. And I'm going to get a timeout. It's going to say, this is not going to work because I never made it down. You put this done in here and you never called it. So if I go over here and I put in the done, I'll get my test to pass again. So what I'm sort of going for here, let me get rid of this stuff so you have an idea now what done does. And I'll get rid of this. And so what I'm going for here is that if I sort of envision what this pipeline is going to do. So if I've got this pipeline, I'm going to read this file, and my file is going to be numbers a text. And the way that my pipeline works is that I'm going to give my pipeline an array of what I call commands. And right now, I just have one command that's going here. Eventually, I'm going to pipe these commands together, and that's going to be what most of the work of the pipeline is going to end up being here. But really, what's happening here is that, assuming that this pipeline is set up correctly, what should happen is it's going to try to run these commands. In this case, I'm going to have this command called cat, which doesn't exist yet. But assuming that I write this and it's written correctly, I'll get a callback. And I'm expecting, if I call this, that it's going to end up reading these results. And the contents of the file is going to equal and this is going to be my number data, which again is just the numbers 1 to 20. Now, of course, none of this is going to work yet, but I know that I am going to have some pipeline function. If I was to go and sort of wanted to fake this working here right now, of course, I'm going to get an issue that cat's not defined. So let's just sort of fake things out a little bit. I'm going to say cat equals, and I'm just going to say it equals an object. I'm just going to get my test to pass. And if I do this, it's going to say, well, pipeline's not a function. Okay, so I'll get pipeline to be a function. So I'm going to export this pipeline. Now I know that what I'm passing in here is going to be my command list, but I'm just going to get this to pass by, here I'm going to be passing in my command list, and this is going to be my done callback. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify, I'm going to use my FS file. And I'm just going to read this file. I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'll say fs read file, and this is going to be numbers. I'm just going to cheat and get this to pass. Show you what I'm sort of going for here. And this is going to be my done function. I'm going to go over here, and just to get this to pass, because I know it's going to pass, here I get my error and my data, and I'm going to do my done callback with no error, and I'll say data, and I know it treats it as a buffer, so I'll just say data to string. And it almost gets my test to pass here. Let's say it's looking like it's got expected 1 to 20. So I've got an extra line break here at the end, which ends up showing up when you read the file. I'm going to get rid of that. And just something to keep in mind is that when I get my data back, I'm going to get rid of any white space here. And now I end up getting my test to pass. Now that's not really what I want to do. What I really want to do is I want to write a pipeline. And in fact, I want to sort of separate things out a little bit. So in fact, I am actually getting my cat command from a require. I'll go up one level to commands. And so what I'm going to eventually want to do is do this. Again, this is going to fail me. So I don't have commands, and I'll go in here. Basically going to be 3 files that I'm going to have open. And so here I'm going to do a module.exports. And here is where I'm going to put in my cat command, which is going to end up working with my pipeline. And that should be enough to get my test to pass again. So really what we want to do here is that we want to build out this functionality of cat. And again, the bottom line here is that we want to be able to go through this, and again, if I was to have another function for word count, I would want that to go and work as well. So let's actually speed this up just a little bit here. So I'll say use the cat command and word count, which doesn't exist. And so certain commands are going to take arguments, like I'm going to need a file for my cat command. But This one is going to be word count, which again doesn't exist. It'll throw an error. And I'm not going to have any arguments. So I'm going to want to pipe what I end up getting in from cat to word count, which again doesn't exist. And I'll get this error message. It's not defined. But we just know the things that we have to build down. It's actually cat is going to be from the command library .cat. And word count is going to be from the command file word count. So if I go back here, I'm going to export word count, and we're going to be focusing on getting this pipeline to run, and that's the next thing that we will end up doing. So one thing to keep in mind is that when we look at sort of building this bash shell, it's a little bit even trickier than a pipeline, because there's this idea of running these commands, and sometimes stuff gets piped in to these commands. But also, there's also arguments for these commands. So for instance, if we ended up doing it, I guess a good way to look at this is that if we did word count ABC. Now let's not, word count is actually, so actually here's an example. If we did word count numbers txt, right? So we're passing in an argument for word count, and it gives us the number of lines, right? So that's an argument that we could end up using for word count. As opposed to if we end up doing cat, and then we pipe it into word count, okay? Now, in fact, we're actually piping what we're getting from one command into the next command, and word count at this point is not getting any arguments, right? But we end up getting this. Now, sometimes you have both. So if you take the example of if we do echo, which basically just pipes something directly into the next command, and I could say foo bar baz, and I use grep, what ends up happening here is that grep ends up getting passed in some value. So the process starts, the process goes through, and I can grep out, and I could give a regular expression or a search term like OO, and I end up getting this. On the same token, right, I could say cat numbers A txt, and I'm pretty sure that I can grep, and let's say I was to grep 6. And that's because I've got the wrong file name. So we're also going to have to keep track of, errors as well. But here you could see that I've got the result of one process, and I'm grepping out, and this is telling me what lines, these are the lines that have matches here. So again, the concept for the pipeline is that there's really a couple of things you have to look at. You have to look at the commands that you want to run in order. You have to look at getting results from one command and passing them into another command. And you also have to add the ability of passing arguments to commands. So that's kind of what I'm trying to simulate here with this idea that we're going to read this file and we're going to end up doing a word count on it. So again, if I ended up taking this off, maybe we could just start with this one to keep things a little bit simpler here, right? And I'm expecting to get my result when I call this from my pipeline. So what might the pipeline look like? Well, what I'm basically going to be looking at doing here is that if this is my pipeline, let's take this out. And what I'm passing to my command list, what I'm passing to my pipeline is a command list, which is basically a collection of commands from one to the other, and also this done function, which again, it's up to me. The way that I'm going to, the way that I've sort of documented this is that if there's an error, I'm going to call done, and the first argument is going to be an error. If I'm able to get the result, I'll call it with the result. So let's think about how that might look. Well, let's assume that what I'm going to be doing here, every time I end up going through and running one of these commands, I'm going to build this function in here. I'm going to call this next. And let's assume, I'll show you how this is going to get used, but let's assume that when next is called, I'm either going to get an error or I'm going to get a result. So I'm going to end up setting this up. So I'm going to basically loop over my commands, and my commands individually are going to be responsible for calling next. Now, if in fact I end up getting an error here, I'm going to be dead in the water, and I'm just going to get out of here, and I'm going to send back that error. So my individual commands are going to be calling next. My pipeline is not calling next on its own. It's my commands that are going to end up doing it. And I'm also going to specify that, hey, look, if in fact my command list dot length still has something in it, okay, I'm going to want to sort of keep on going. So what is that going to look like? Well, I'm going to have a function that I'm going to call. I'm going to call it process. And I'm going to process it with the result that I have so far. And I'll show you what this is in a second. Otherwise, if in fact I've gotten through all my commands, I'm going to call done without an error with whatever my result is. Now, again, this doesn't really mean anything at the moment, but the way that this is going to work is that I'm going to have this function process. And the way that process works is I'm going to pass into process a start value. This is what would be piped into the next command. We're going to have a starting point for it. But this is what's going to be piped into the next command. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a command, and I'm going to get it from my command list, and I'm going to get it by shifting, by pulling off the first item. Again, this is a queue. I want to run my first command. I want to pass it into my next command, and so on and so forth. Now, again, if you notice back here in my pipeline spec, the way that I want this to get written is each of these has a function, and it has the possibility of having some arguments. Again, you don't necessarily have to have arguments. Word count, for instance, can have arguments when it has a file, but it doesn't have to have arguments. So what I'm going to do here in my pipeline is within my pipeline, I'm going to shift this off, and I'm going to say to my command function, I'm going to grab the function, and I'm going to say, well, here's your starting point, and I'm going to pass you your arguments, and I'm also going to pass you next. So it's going to be up to you to call next. So what this is telling me is what the signature of all of my commands should look like. They should have a signature where I'm passing in a starting value. Again, depending on what the command is, that starting value might not end up being anything. Possible command arguments. I would assume they should have one or the other, although, yeah, I would assume that to be the case. And the next function, again, is going to end up getting used. I'm going to pass it here, so I'm expecting that my command function is at some point going to call next, and either it's going to call it with an error or it's going to call it with a result. And the fact is, I've got to get the ball rolling on this. So I'm going to end up calling process, and I'm not really starting anything with this process. I've got this collection of commands. Right now, it's not really going to do anything because the only command I'm testing with is this cat, and this cat doesn't even do anything. But I do know that the cat is going to have a signature, which I'm going to set up. And so when I look at cat, cat's going to have some kind of start value. All the commands in the pipeline have to have this signature because they're all being called the same way. So that's just the way that they have to be written. A string of arguments and a next function. So let's think about how this would actually work. Right now, if we end up going back to our pipeline, let's actually even make it a little bit more interesting. And I'm going to call the cat. One of the things you could do with the cat function is you have the ability to, do cat numbers. I might have shown you this before. Txt numbers a.txt, and this is just going to concatenate all the numbers. So let's actually see if we can write that out. Let's actually, again, this is probably a bit much for a test, but in the spirit of doing this in a reasonable time period, let's go in here, and let's assume that we're going to write this cat function that is going to be able to take these arguments and end up getting these results. So what might that look like? Well, I'm going to do something a little bit magical here, and then I'll explain what each thing does, and I apologize in advance because I know that could be somewhat frustrating. But I'm going to go up here, and for my cat function, that wasn't what I really wanted to copy. Let me fix that. So what I'm going to do here is I really want to have this function. And it's a bit of code, but we could walk through it, explain what it's doing. So when I end up calling my pipeline, first of all, I'm going to need, I see here I'm using fs, so I'm going to bring in fs. And let's just tease this thing out. So my arguments are coming in, and I'm basically saying, hey, look, you could pass me more than one file if you want to. And so I'm splitting it a space. These are going to be the names of my files. And I'm going to store an array of my results, and I'm going to set up a counter of 0. And I'll get back into this process file in a second here. But what I'm going to do for each of my files is that I'm going to loop over here. I'm simply looping over the names of my files. And the for each allows me to get a file and also an index, which is going to come in handy. And once I end up getting each of these files, I'm going to read these files. Now, I might either get an error, or I might end up getting a result. So let's take the case if I get an error, I'm going to call this process file, and I'm going to get out of this callback. I'm going to call process file with this error. I don't have any results, and I'm going to pass the index because I want to specify what the error is. Okay? If in fact I'm able to read the file, I'm going to get the result. I'm going to do toString, and I'm going to get rid of that annoying extra space that I have there. And here I'm going to call process file with no error, my data, plus the index. And I'm going to get the index because I want to actually return the files in order. If I didn't really care about the order, I wouldn't really worry about it. Although in my case, the order is not going to be terribly critical because I'm reading the same file. But let's actually look at this process file. So this process file is going to get a possible error, a result, which would be the information that got read, and an index. And again, if you look at the way the pipeline function works, if in fact there was an error, I'm going to call next. I'm going to get the index piped in here. So I'm basically saying to my pipeline, hey, look, pipeline, we got a little bit of a problem here. Here was the error, and I'm going to pass this error back. If I don't end up getting an error, I'm going to basically put in my results array at that index, the result of my file. And I'm going to increase my counter here. And I know that I'm done reading all my files if, in fact, the counter that I have is equal to the length of the files that I passed in. And when that's the case, I'm going to use this reduce function, which you haven't used. If you haven't used it, it's kind of useful, which is I'm going to take my results, which is going to be basically an array of file contents. Again, if it's just one file that I read, it's just going to have a length of 1, but I'm going to reduce it. And the way that the reduce function works is that you sort of have this starting point, which is this second parameter, which is the empty array, and that gets passed in as memo, and I'm looping over my results. So basically, we've sort of written functions like this when we flatten things out, but this ends up getting called, and I'm going to take my memo and I'm going to concat each result that I get, and I'm basically getting all my lines from all my files. So this is one file, I'm splitting it, add a line break, and I'd be concatenating all those together. And when I'm done doing that, I'm going to call next. I'm not going to have any errors here, and I'm going to join things back up. So let's see how that would end up working. And I'm pretty close here, but what's some of my issues here? So I have concatenated this, but the issue that I have here is that what I really want to test out here, I could get this to pass if I just call this once. And now I end up passing, but the fact that I'm calling it twice, if I go in here, what I really expect to have happen is I'm going to have my number data, and let me actually concat it to another set of number data. And if I join it by a line break, I should end up getting my test to pass. So, you know, again, there's a fair amount of work in the individual commands. That's true. But what this allows me to do is to really just focus on those commands. Again, here is the next that gets passed in here. So the way that this works, I've got a start value. And in fact, in my case here with my cat, this might not be a complete solution. I basically just wanted to read files and pipe out the results to something else if there is something at the end of that pipe. But I'm not using it here. But the key here is that my pipeline is going to be calling things with these three arguments. So it's a starting value, command arguments, and next. Now, we could actually modify this and actually have a real pipeline here by going over here and specifying that here I'm actually reading numbers. I'm not going to use my word count. Reading numbers.txt, I'll say twice. And I'm going to copy and paste this. And I'll go down here. That doesn't look right. So here I'm using the cat command. And here I'm going to test out not just the cat command, but I'll test out the cat command with the word count command. So what do I expect here? Well, if I've got another function, and this function is going to be word count, and there aren't any arguments that are here. So this should read this. I should get returns, not the contents of the file, returns the word count. So for me, this is just going to be the lines that I'm reading here. So I'm going to say I expect the result to equal, and I'll go over here and I'll say I expect this to be 20. Actually, this is going to be the numbers. I'm doing this twice, so I would expect my word count to be 40. Again, we don't have this function set up yet. And in fact, as a result, this is going to sort of crash out because my done is never going to get called. But let's take a look and see what the word count is going to look like. This should be a little bit easier to write. So here, the word count is actually a little bit simpler. And this is not the complete implementation of the word count, right? If I end up looking in the shell and I end up using the word count could either be called on the right side of the pipe or, on the left side by saying word count, numbers txt, and doing it that way, right? Or, cat, word count, which is really getting the same results. So what I would like to do here is let's actually go back here. And for word count, again, all these things are going to have the same signature. Start, which is something that's being piped in, arguments, if there are arguments, and next. And that was not what I wanted to do. That's my word count function. So what do I actually want here? This is a real simple one. So when something gets piped into word count, again, I'm assuming that maybe I should have some error handling, but when something ends up getting piped into word count, and this is only half an implementation, if in fact there were arguments, then maybe I would attempt to go and read the file. But here I'm basically just taking what gets passed in, I'm going to trim things out, and I'm going to end up splitting at the line break, and that's going to be my word count. Really, it's my line count. So if I end up doing that, I could end up getting this to pass. So really, the key thing here is that, again, there's a little bit of work that you have in this function, but if you sort of go through the logic, again, the tricky part here is the whole idea that you have these asynchronous methods, and you really have to track these asynchronous methods. So it's not just that, the callback for read file gets called once, right? You have to actually check, did you have any errors? And if you didn't have any errors, I call this other function. But again, the key thing here is I don't end up calling my callback until, in fact, I've read from all the files, or I end up getting an error. And so, one thing we could do here, just for the sake of argument, this should be a pretty quick one, is that if I was to go and do my pipeline spec, and here I'm going to say, here's the cat command, and I'll go in here and I'll say, instead of reading this twice, I'm going to read it twice, but with a file that doesn't exist. Reading a bad file. What's a bad file? Well, we'll just try a file that doesn't exist. So numbers exist, but I'm going to read foo.txt. And what it's going to do here is that this is going to end up erroring out, and I'm not going to have any results. So let's just look and see how I would end up testing that out. So it's saying I expected undefined to equal this, and here I really am expecting to get an error. So in this case, for this test, I'll say result equals this error that I got. Let's see what that error looks like. And I'll say it returns the correct error. In which case, what I'm really getting back is this error reading file foo.txt. So in order to get this to pass, I could go over here and say, I expect my result, which again is an error, to equal, or at least an error message, to equal this message. And that ends up passing, right? So reading a bad file returns the correct error. So that works fairly well. And again, the thing is that these individual commands can be a little bit tricky. Again, I think my first cut on this was just to make sure that I could read one file, which was a lot easier to do. You didn't have to worry about doing this counting or all this other stuff. And again, if I was going to sort of redo this from scratch, that's what I would probably do. But again, the big takeaway here is the fact that I'm passing in these objects to the pipeline. And I'm starting this process, I'm shifting off this command, and I'm calling each of these functions in turn. I pass in this next function, and it's up to each of these commands to call the next function either with an error or with the result. If it turns out that I'm done with all my commands, then I'm basically just going to call done with the result. Otherwise, I'm going to do another process with whatever result ended up getting piped in. So again, you're sort of dealing with a few callbacks here, but the pipeline itself, I think my big takeaway here is that the pipeline itself is fairly simplistic, right? It's basically just looping over this command list. The thing that's a little bit trickier is how do we go about getting the command list? So that's the next thing that we'll take a look at. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another test file. So I'm trying to sort of break this out. And I'm going to call this pipeline parser spec. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do some copying and pasting. And I know that this looks like a lot here, but it's actually a lot more simplistic than the other one because there's nothing asynchronous that's happening here. So let's actually bring in my expect. And what I'm going to do here, so if you look at this first test, this is basically turn this string into a command. And so when I say to my pipeline parser, here's this command, so I don't have any pipes here. But if I look at this command, what I expect to happen is that when I parse this, it's going to give me command list, which is what I basically ended up using in my last test for the pipeline. So the args should be food.test, the length should be 1. On the same token, now I don't have these commands here, so let's actually go over here and say commands equals require. Not actually calling the commands, I'm just making sure that these are the commands that I'm going to be using. On the same token, if I do this and I have the splitter here, what I expect is that my command list is going to have a length of 2, and here I'm just looking at the second one. The function is going to be commands WC. Now, on the same token, I'm not going to bother running anything if, in fact, I try to parse my commands and I can't find a command. So here's the way that you could test out an exception here, and I'm expecting that if I end up parsing this guy out, since this is, again, the way that it's going to break this out, it's going to find the command from this part, and it's going to take this second part, and it's going to put it in the arguments. So command, this one's not going to have any arguments, but I expect this to give me an error that says, hey, look, this is a bad command fizz, right? Command is not that's not a valid one. Now, if I go to run this, this is going to fail miserably. I think maybe it's not picking up that test file. Let's make sure it picks it up. So here it says I don't really know what pipeline parser is. So let's go in and actually create a pipeline parser. And we'll do it by requiring something that doesn't exist yet. Pipeline parser JS. And let's go over here. So if I go in here to this, save that, let's see what this pipeline parser is going to look like. It's actually not all that complicated. And again, my goal here is to sort of break this thing out into, sort of small steps here. So I'll walk you through this again. I'm going to copy and paste this, but this is sort of similar to what I had to my reduce function, which you saw before. So let me go in here to my pipeline parser. Okay, and let's sort of tease this thing out. So here I'm basically putting in this input. Let me actually bring in my commands. Again, this is just key values of my commands. And again, the big takeaway from all those commands, they have the exact same signature. So again, what this is doing is just doing some parsing. So it's taking the input, it's splitting it at the underscore, at the pipe character. And again, I'm using my reduce function. So I'm using my reduce function. I want to get this array that ends up coming back here. So for each of my, so I'm saying, hey, look, I'm basically going to be dealing with these command strings. And I want to trim them, get rid of the white space. and I'm going to take my parts and I'm going to split it by the space. So my command itself is going to be the first command, right? The first part is going to be the command, and I'm just going to say, hey, look, did you find the command? If you didn't find the command, let's throw an error. Bad command for this part. That would take care of the fizz one. And then basically I've split this thing apart. So now I'm going to take this parts. I'm going to end up slicing it, but I don't want the command. I just want the rest of the array, and I'm just going to join them back together, and that's going to be my arguments. I'm going to then take this memo, which ends up getting passed in reduce, and here's my function, which is going to have my command, and it's going to have my arguments, and I could end up returning my memo. So let's see if that ends up getting my test to pass. Can't find module commands, and that's because this is in the same folder. So the thing again that I think is kind of interesting is that the code itself is not really all that crazy. I mean, you have to take a look at it a little bit, right? This is definitely for sure, the pipeline is a little bit trickier, but it's not a lot of stuff. I'm basically just calling these functions and making sure that this pipeline of callbacks ends up getting called. Pipeline parser is just splitting some strings, but my specs are pretty big. Here's my pipeline spec, where I assume that I've already parsed my pipeline out. You could have done this in a different order if you want to. And this is going to be my spec for my pipeline parser, just to see that I can parse these things out correctly. Now, once I have those two things built, and again, this is minimal. I don't really have that many commands that are here. The next thing that I want to do is actually build my shell. So the shell is really the last thing that I'm doing here. I'm taking care of these two other things, which I can test separately, and it's going to make my life a little bit easier. Again, I could always end up adding commands and adding tests, but I feel pretty confident in my pipeline. I feel pretty confident in my pipeline parser. So that's kind of a nice position to be in. So let's see what our shell would end up looking like. So this is a very sort of basic implementation of the shell. And so I'll go over here, and I'm going to create a file. This is going to be bash.js. And I'm not really even testing this out because I feel confident with my pipeline parser that if you look at this, what I'm really doing here, I'm getting my parser, and I'm getting my pipeline. I'm using chalk here. So this is the same things that were in the workshop. Here's my prompt. And when I end up getting some data, I'm just trimming it out. And I'm just going to put a try block here. And I'm going to say, well, here's my command list. I'm going to ask my parser to parse it. If there's an error, I'll end up logging out the error. So in fact, I guess I could have an error with my parser, which is possible. But otherwise, here's where I'm using my pipeline. And I'm using my pipeline. Here's my command list. If I have an error, I'm going to write out the results in red. If I don't have an error, I'm going to send out the result from the pipeline, and I'm going to do a standard out. So again, the big thing is that I'm breaking this up into 4 different files. I have the ability to test out both the parser as well as the pipeline. And now if I was to go and run this, again, I don't really have a test for this, which is kind of funny because this is sort of the end product. But if I went over here and I said node bash JS, if I went over here and I said cat numbers a.txt, these are my numbers. If I said cat numbers a.txt, and I did that again, all right, I feel pretty confident that this is going to work, right? And if I said cat numbers a.txt, numbers a.txt, the only 2 that I can really do are going to be word count. Then I can do word count, and I should get 40. So that's about the extent of it. But again, I didn't end up going into this part really into the end until I had confidence that, I was able to parse things correctly. And here's my pipeline. And the nice thing about it is that, if I wanted to add functionality to it, again, if I have that confidence with my pipeline, if I have that confidence with my parser, I could add as many different commands as I want to do, different things, all the different things in the workshop. So hopefully you guys found that interesting.